Good morning, Honors Biology class. This will be our first lecture of the week. We will have 4 more lectures, one each day, of course. So we're going to be moving into Chapter 11, Complex Inheritance and Human Heredity. In particular, we're going to start with Section 1. Section 1 is Basic Patterns of Human Inheritance. In other words, how do traits get passed through families? In other words, how do we pass on our genetics to the next generation? Well, let's consider some learning objectives that we'll cover as we go through this. Objective 1. Analyze genetic patterns to determine dominant or recessive inheritance patterns. In other words, we're going to analyze. It means we're going to break down the genetic patterns to determine whether it's a dominant or recessive inheritance pattern. Objective 2, summarize examples of dominant and recessive disorders. In other words, we're going to make a summary statement or summary comments about dominant and recessive disorders. And then third objective, construct human pedigrees from genetic information. In other words, how do we understand how genetics passes? Well, we do it through a pedigree which shows us where it's passing through and how it's passing through. Let's cover some quick biofacts found on slides 4 and 5. Sometimes different ethnic groups can be distinguished by phenotypic traits. That means those traits that are visual, such as skin color, hair color, and skin folds at the corners of the eyes. Another interesting biology fact is that individual genetic differences within an ethnic group can be greater than the genetic differences between individuals of two different ethnic groups, which is pretty amazing to consider. All right. So the big idea of Chapter 11 is human inheritance does not always follow Mendel's laws. Remember, we talked about Mendel's laws as we went through the previous chapters. Now, while that applies to plants and animals, humans don't always follow it, and you'll see how that applies as we continue or moving along in Chapter 11. Now, the main idea of Section 11.1 is this. The inheritance of a trait over several generations can be shown in a pedigree. So a pedigree is a diagram that visualizes how those traits are passed throughout generations. All right, so let's go ahead and connect this quickly to life outside the classroom just to kind of get our minds seeing that we need to be thinking about this knowledge in light of not only academically studying this, but our lives as well. Now, if a dog owner can know the ancestry, in other words, they buy a dog and they know what its genetics are, they can analyze potential health problems and anything else that may come and best prepare for being able to care for that animal. This can also be said for humans. We can trace our inheritance to show how traits are passed from generation to generation. This is helpful, especially for those who are going to have children. Any things that they can prepare for conditions that could be passed on genetically, either on the mom or the dad's side as well. Now, what's interesting, ladies and gentlemen, is that even though we talked about Mendel and his contribution to science, his work was actually ignored for more than 30 years. It wasn't until the early 1900s that scientists in general began taking an interest. That means all of a sudden rediscovering this great source of information that Mendel had done in his studies, and thus, in essence, discovered Mendel's work, but just rediscovered the concepts that he had already discovered. Now, moving into slide 11, a little more connection to history. Around this time when Mendel's work was rediscovered, or discovered for the first time, so to speak, in England, in the country of England, there was a doctor, Dr. Archibald Garrett. He became interested between a disorder in particular and the enzyme deficiency, which was called alkaptonuria. Now, what does this disorder do? It causes a person's urine to be black in color, which I'm sure if any of us ever use the restroom and that happened, that would be pretty weird and scare us at first. So the urine, the reason why it's black is due to the acid that is excreted into the urine itself. Now, Dr. Garrett made some observations. One of them is that he noticed this condition wasn't something that just came about at any particular age. It actually started at birth. In other words, when this child, whether male or female, was born, and continued then through the rest of the patient's lives, which ultimately not only affected the color of their urine, but also their bones and their joints. In other words, the point where the bones join together. Now, another observation that he made was that it was found in multiple people within the same family. In other words, this had to be something that was being passed down genetically speaking from family member to family member. Now, with the help of another scientist, they found that the disorder itself was a recessive genetic disorder. That meaning that it needed to be homozygous recessive for this to be passed on. In other words, if you were doing a Punnett square, that would be like a 1 in 4 chance, so to speak, on that just basic generic Punnett square I've shown you before in class. If you need me, I can post another one. Now, something we can be thankful about, that in light of studying the two scientists, at least two, Dr. Garrett and the other scientists as well, that as we continue to grow in our understanding of genetic disorders as we study them, and with the accumulation of knowledge that comes as a result of those studies, we can better help people who have those conditions, and those conditions will become less of a extreme challenge, and we can, provide other ways to help them. Now, before we move on to mention and discuss some recessive genetic disorders, we need to define a term, and that being a carrier. Now, generally speaking, we've talked about if someone's dominant for a trait or recessive. Well, what is a carrier? A carrier is an individual who is heterozygous for a recessive disorder. Let me state that again. A carrier is an individual who is heterozygous for a recessive disorder. All right, there is a table, and I did provide a picture on slide number 16 of that. It's at table 11.2. That's from. You can go ahead and make sure if you can copy this in. It gives the terms homozygous and heterozygous with an example. All right. Now, just letting you know, in our next video lecture, we're going to start briefly discussing 4 recessive genetic disorders, and we'll be starting with cystic fibrosis. Look forward to you guys checking these out, and feel free to leave comments below in the video. Thank you. Have a nice day.